Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're stepping into a time machine, traveling back over a century to explore what daily life was truly like in America during the early 1900s. Before we begin this journey together, if you enjoy these deep dives into history, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep creating these stories for you. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time period you'd most like to explore next. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and let's ease into the early 20th century together. Because what we think we know about this era and what it was actually like are often two very different things. Picture this. It's January 1st, 1900. Church bells are ringing across America, ushering in not just a new year, but an entirely new century. Newspapers proclaim it the age of progress, the beginning of modernity. And in many ways, they were right. But for the average American, life in 1900 looked remarkably different from the gleaming promises of the modern age. Most Americans at the turn of the century still lived in rural areas. Farms dotted the landscape from coast to coast, and the rhythms of agricultural life dictated the pace of existence for millions. Cities were growing rapidly, yes, swelling with immigrants and workers drawn by the promise of industrial jobs. But the transformation from an agrarian society to an industrial powerhouse was still very much in progress, and that transition brought with it extraordinary challenges. The United States in 1900 was a nation of contrasts. Wealthy industrialists lived in mansions that rivaled European palaces, while millions of workers barely scraped by in conditions that would shock us today. The gap between rich and poor was staggering, and the middle class as we know it was only beginning to emerge. Life expectancy tells us a lot about this era. In 1900, the average American could expect to live to around 47 years old. That's 30 years less than we expect today. Infant and child mortality was heartbreakingly common. Based on the data we have, around 30% of all deaths occurred in children under age 5. Infant mortality was staggeringly high, with estimates suggesting that more than 1 in 10 babies didn't survive their first year. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and the harsh realities of daily life all took their toll in ways that modern medicine and public health measures have thankfully made much rarer. The America of 1900 was also undergoing massive demographic changes. Between 1880 and 1910, well over 18 million immigrants arrived on American shores. If we extend to 1930, that number rises to more than 23 million. Most of these new arrivals came from Southern and Eastern Europe. They brought their languages, their customs, their hopes, and their desperate need for work. These new arrivals transformed American cities, creating vibrant ethnic neighborhoods, but also facing discrimination and exploitation that makes for some of the darkest chapters in American history. Let's step inside a typical home in the early 1900s. What you'd find would depend greatly on where you were and how much money your family had. But for most Americans, home was a far cry from the comfortable dwellings we know today. In rural areas, farmhouses were functional but often Spartan. Many were still made of wood, heated by wood-burning stoves or fireplaces. On cold winter mornings, you'd wake to frost on the inside of your windows. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, the heart of family life, where the stove provided not just a place to cook, but essential warmth during frigid months. Electricity was still a luxury in 1900. While cities were beginning to install electric infrastructure, rural areas wouldn't see widespread electrification until the 1930s, with Roosevelt's Rural Electrification Administration. So most Americans still lived by the rhythms of natural light. When the sun went down, you lit kerosene lamps or candles. Reading at night meant straining your eyes in flickering light. Going to the bathroom meant a trip to the outhouse, even in winter. even in the dark. Speaking of bathrooms, indoor plumbing was far from universal. Many homes, even in cities, lacked running water. You'd fetch water from a well or a neighborhood pump, carrying heavy buckets back to your home for cooking, cleaning, and washing. Bathing was an occasional event, not a daily ritual. Saturday night baths became common practice in many households, likely because Sunday was the day for church and social gatherings, so people wanted to be clean for the Sabbath. Family members often shared the same tub of heated water, simply out of the sheer effort required to heat enough water for multiple baths. For urban workers, especially immigrants, housing conditions were often appalling. In cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, tenement buildings packed families into cramped, dark spaces. A typical tenement apartment might consist of 3 small rooms for an entire family. 4 to 6 stories high, these buildings were constructed quickly and cheaply. Many had no windows in interior rooms. Fire escapes were often the only source of ventilation. The dumbbell tenement, winning a design competition in 1878, sponsored by Plumber and Sanitary Engineer magazine, and supposedly representing an improvement over earlier models, became notorious. Named for its shape when viewed from above, these buildings had a narrow air shaft in the middle that was supposed to provide light and ventilation. In reality, these shafts became repositories for garbage and provided minimal improvement. The rooms that faced these shafts were perpetually dim, the air thick and stale. In such buildings, privacy was impossible. Thin walls meant you heard everything from neighboring apartments. Extended families often lived together out of economic necessity, with multiple generations sharing those few small rooms. Kitchen tables served as workspaces during the day and sleeping surfaces at night. Children slept 2, 3, or 4 to a bed. The density was staggering. In Manhattan's Lower East Side, some blocks had population densities of 800 people per acre, making it one of the most crowded places on Earth. Entire families might live in spaces of 300 to 400 square feet. Tuberculosis, called the White Plague, spread rapidly in such conditions. This infectious disease was the 3rd leading cause of death in America during this period, claiming around 150,000 lives annually across the nation. Tenements lacked adequate sanitation. In the worst buildings, one outhouse might serve 20 or more families. These weren't always indoors either. Imagine making that trip on a freezing January night. Water had to be carried from a communal tap in the hallway or courtyard. Doing laundry meant hauling water, heating it on the stove, scrubbing clothes on a washboard, and then hanging them to dry wherever space could be found. Even for those who could afford better housing, modern conveniences were minimal. Refrigeration meant ice boxes, wooden cabinets insulated with cork or sawdust, where you'd place a large block of ice delivered by the iceman. The ice would last a few days if you were lucky, keeping perishables moderately cool. Milk and meat spoiled quickly. Food shopping was a nearly daily necessity. Heating was a constant challenge. Coal-burning furnaces were becoming more common in middle-class homes, but they required constant attention. Someone had to wake early to stoke the fire, and the process created endless coal dust and ash that had to be removed. Wood stoves needed regular feeding. In poor households, families huddled together for warmth, wearing layers of clothing even indoors during winter. The homes of the wealthy stood in stark contrast. By 1900, the richest Americans had embraced new technologies with enthusiasm. Their mansions boasted electric lighting, central heating, indoor plumbing with hot and cold running water, and even early telephone service. But these amenities remained out of reach for the vast majority of Americans for decades to come. Work defined life in early 20th century America in ways that are hard for us to imagine today. The 40-hour work week didn't exist. The weekend as we know it, a concept of 2 full days off, was a distant dream. For most American workers, labor was grueling, dangerous, and consumed the bulk of their waking hours. In factories, the standard work week was 60 hours. That's 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. In steel mills and other heavy industries, 12-hour shifts were common, with workers laboring 7 days a week. Imagine leaving your home before dawn, working a 12-hour shift in a deafening, dangerous factory, and returning home in darkness 6 or 7 days every single week. The average factory wage in 1900 was about 20 cents per hour, which works out to roughly $600 per year. That might sound impossibly low, and it was. Historians estimate that this wage left approximately 20% of urban workers at or below the poverty line. Skilled workers earned more, perhaps $1 per day, but even they struggled to support families on those wages. Factory conditions were harsh beyond the long hours. There were no safety regulations worth mentioning. Machines had no guards or protective barriers. Workers, exhausted from endless hours, lost fingers, hands, or limbs in industrial accidents with frightening regularity. In 1913, one of the few years for which we have good data, nearly 25,000 Americans died on the job. Another 700,000 were injured seriously enough to miss at least a month of work. The work itself was mind-numbing. The rise of assembly line production and scientific management, championed by industrial engineers like Frederick Winslow Taylor, broke complex tasks into simple, repetitive motions. A worker might spend an entire shift tightening the same bolt on an endless procession of identical products. The goal was efficiency, but the cost was the dehumanization of labor. Workers became extensions of their machines, valued only for their ability to maintain production speed. Factory owners faced no requirement to compensate injured workers or the families of those killed on the job. No workers' compensation laws existed in most states. If you were hurt, you were simply fired and replaced. Your family was left to fend for itself. Some companies might offer a token payment to a widow, more to protect their public image than out of any sense of obligation, but many offered nothing at all. Then there was the nightmare of child labor. In 1900, 18% of all American workers were under the age of 16. Let that sink in. Nearly 1 in 5 workers was a child. Over 750,000 children under 15 worked in factories, mines, and fields across the nation. The most tragic part: many families needed this income desperately. A child's wages, pitiful as they were, might mean the difference between eating and going hungry. Children worked the same long hours as adults, but earned a fraction of the pay, typically 10 to 20% of an adult wage. Some worked for nothing more than room and board. In textile mills, small children called doffers crawled under running machinery to replace full bobbins with empty ones. Their small size made them ideal for this dangerous work. In coal mines, young boys called breaker boys separated coal from slate in clouds of choking dust, their fingers bleeding from the sharp edges of the rock. Many developed black lung disease before reaching adulthood. The work children did was often specifically dangerous. They were employed as chimney sweeps, forced to climb inside narrow, soot-filled flues. They worked in glass factories, standing near furnaces in temperatures that would make adults faint. They labored in canneries, their hands moving with mechanical precision to avoid the sharp tools they used to prepare food. Industrial accidents involving children were common, though often underreported. Education took a back seat to economic necessity. While Massachusetts had required school attendance since 1852, most states had no such laws in 1900. Even where compulsory education laws existed, they were poorly enforced, especially for children of immigrants and the poor. A child working in a factory wasn't learning to read or developing skills that might lift the family out of poverty. The cycle was self-perpetuating. Agricultural work, while different from factory labor, was no less demanding. Farm families worked from sunup to sundown, every day, following the rhythms of planting and harvest. Children on farms started helping with chores as soon as they could walk. By 5 or 6, they were feeding chickens, gathering eggs, or helping in the garden. By 10 or 12, they were doing adult work, plowing fields behind horses or mules, milking cows, hauling water, cutting wood. The seasonal nature of farm work meant periods of brutal intensity, especially during planting and harvest. Everyone in the family worked these periods, knowing that a poor harvest could mean genuine hunger in the coming winter. There were no days off, no vacations. Livestock needed feeding and milking every single day, regardless of weather, illness, or exhaustion. Women's work, whether in factories, on farms, or in homes, was equally demanding, but often invisible in the historical record. In 1900, more than 5 million American women worked outside the home, triple the number just 30 years earlier. Most were young, under 25, and either immigrants or daughters of immigrants. They worked in garment factories, textile mills, as domestic servants, as shop clerks, or in the emerging clerical sector as typists and telephone operators. Women workers faced additional challenges. They were paid significantly less than men for the same work, typically earning half of what male workers made. The rationale was that women were working for pin money, or just until they married, not supporting families, even though this was demonstrably false for millions of working women. Sexual harassment was rampant and completely unaddressed by any law or policy. Women who complained risked losing their jobs. The concept of a weekend was only beginning to emerge. Some progressive employers experimented with giving workers Saturday afternoons off, but this was far from universal. Sunday was the traditional day of rest, rooted in religious observance, but even then, many workers had to labor. Stores remained open. Factories in some industries ran continuously. Domestic servants, overwhelmingly women, worked 7 days a week in the homes of the wealthy, with only occasional time off. Unions were fighting for better conditions, but they faced enormous obstacles. Most Americans in 1900 didn't belong to unions. The American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886, represented primarily skilled workers in craft unions. Unskilled workers, immigrants, women, and African Americans were largely excluded from union membership. When workers did strike for better conditions, they faced brutal opposition. Companies hired private security forces or called in state militias to break strikes. The Pullman strike of 1894 and the Homestead strike of 1892 had shown workers the violent lengths to which corporations would go to resist organized labor. Yet despite these conditions, despite the danger and the exhaustion and the poverty wages, workers kept showing up. They had no choice. There was no safety net, no unemployment insurance, no welfare programs, no social security. You worked or you starved. It was that simple. What Americans ate in the early 1900s depended greatly on where they lived and how much money they had. But for most people, the diet was monotonous, heavily starch-based, and lacking in the variety we take for granted today. For rural families, food came primarily from what they could grow or raise themselves. Gardens provided vegetables during the growing season. Root vegetables like potatoes, carrots, turnips, and beets could be stored in cool cellars for winter use. Families canned and preserved fruits and vegetables during the summer and fall, putting up hundreds of jars to sustain them through the winter months. This was hot, exhausting work, typically done by women and girls, standing over boiling pots on wood-burning stoves during the hottest days of summer. Meat was a staple, but its availability varied. In rural areas, families might raise chickens for eggs and occasional meat, keep a pig to slaughter in the fall, and perhaps have a cow for milk and butter. Hunting and fishing supplemented the diet in many regions. But fresh meat spoiled quickly without refrigeration. So much of it was preserved through smoking, salting, or curing. Ham and bacon were staples because pork could be effectively preserved. Beef was less common for ordinary families, reserved for special occasions. The early 1900s saw Americans consuming an astonishing amount of sugar, roughly 65 pounds per person per year by 1909. This marked a dramatic increase from previous generations, made possible by cheaper sugar from the Caribbean and improved refining techniques. Sweet tea and coffee became popular. Cakes, pies, and other desserts became more common in American households. This increase in sugar consumption contributed to increasing rates of tooth decay and likely other health problems, though the connection to diseases like diabetes wasn't yet understood. Urban dwellers had different food experiences. Without gardens or livestock, city residents depended on markets and stores. Chain grocery stores were just beginning to appear. The A&P introduced its economy store model in 1912, small shops that didn't offer credit or delivery but provided lower prices. Before chain stores became widespread, people shopped at smaller neighborhood markets or from street vendors. Food safety was a serious concern. There was no Food and Drug Administration yet, no regulations governing food purity or safety. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 would begin to address these issues, but in 1900, anything went. Milk often came from diseased cows and was delivered unpasteurized, making it a common source of tuberculosis and other diseases. Meat from slaughterhouses was often contaminated. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, published in 1906, would expose the horrifying conditions in Chicago's meatpacking plants and help spur food safety reforms. Bread was the foundation of most meals. Whole grain bread, made from coarse rye or barley flour, was common among poorer families. White flour was more expensive and considered superior. Most families either baked their own bread or bought it from neighborhood bakeries. Store-bought sliced bread wouldn't appear until the 1920s. Breakfast for working-class families might be porridge made from oatmeal or cornmeal, perhaps with molasses for sweetness. Coffee or tea, bread with butter if you could afford it. Middle-class families might have eggs, some meat, and better bread. The midday meal, called dinner by many families, was often the largest meal of the day. For working men, this might be carried to the job site in a metal lunch pail. For children in school, those lucky enough to attend, lunch was whatever they could carry from home. School cafeterias and hot lunch programs didn't exist in most places. A typical worker's lunch might be bread, cheese, some cold meat if available, maybe an apple or another piece of fruit. The evening meal, or supper, varied enormously. For poor urban families, it might be little more than bread and coffee. For those with a bit more money, perhaps a stew or soup, stretching a small amount of meat with lots of potatoes and other vegetables. For rural families, the evening meal might include fresh vegetables in season, salt pork or other preserved meat, cornbread or biscuits, and milk. Dietary variety was limited. Most people ate the same basic foods day after day. Fresh fruits were a seasonal treat. Oranges and other citrus fruits were rare and expensive, imported from Florida or California. Bananas, brought by refrigerated ships from Central America, were becoming more available, but were still seen as exotic. Tropical fruits like pineapples were rare luxuries. Vitamin deficiencies were common, though not yet understood. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C affected urban poor who had little access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Rickets from vitamin D deficiency was epidemic among children in northern cities, where tall buildings blocked sunlight and polluted air dimmed what light reached the streets. Pellagra, caused by niacin deficiency and common among poor Southerners whose diet depended heavily on corn, caused skin lesions, diarrhea, and dementia. The early 1900s also saw the rise of processed and convenience foods. Jell-O was invented and marketed heavily. Canned foods became increasingly common, though some were skeptical of food that came in tins. Campbell's soup, Heinz ketchup, and Kellogg's cereals were becoming household names. These products promised convenience and consistency, appealing particularly to middle-class urban women who were expected to manage households with less help than their mother's generation had enjoyed. Restaurants existed primarily in cities, and most were out of reach for working-class families. Lunch counters and cafeterias were beginning to appear, offering cheap, quick meals for workers. The first pizza restaurant opened in New York City in 1905, bringing Italian cuisine to a broader audience. But for most Americans, eating out was a rare treat, if it happened at all. For immigrant families, food was one of the ways they maintained connections to their homelands. Italian families made pasta. Jewish families kept kosher and ate traditional foods. Polish, Russian, Greek, and other immigrant groups maintained their food traditions as best they could with available ingredients. These ethnic neighborhoods created demand for specialty foods, and small shops opened to supply them, adding to the incredible culinary diversity of American cities. The ritual of family meals was important in an era before televisions and other distractions. Families ate together, sitting at kitchen or dining tables. Mealtimes were opportunities to share the day's events, discuss problems, make plans. But the pace of modern life was beginning to erode even this tradition. Fathers working long factory shifts might not be home for dinner. Children working or attending school had conflicting schedules. The family meal as an unquestioned daily ritual was already beginning to fragment. If there's one area where the gulf between the early 1900s and today is most dramatic, it's health and medicine. Life in 1900 meant living with diseases and medical conditions that we've largely conquered, and facing illness with medical treatments that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Let's start with the blunt statistics. In 1900, infectious diseases were the leading cause of death. Pneumonia and influenza topped the list, followed by tuberculosis and diarrheal diseases. Together, these infectious diseases accounted for roughly 1/3 of all deaths. Compare that to today, where chronic diseases like heart disease and cancer are the primary killers, but infectious diseases account for only a tiny fraction of deaths. The 1918 influenza pandemic, though it came later in our period, illustrated just how vulnerable people were to infectious disease. That pandemic killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, including about 675,000 Americans. It struck suddenly, overwhelmed medical systems, and killed quickly. Many victims were young, healthy adults. People went to bed feeling fine and were dead within days. There was no treatment. Doctors could only try to keep patients comfortable while the disease ran its course. Tuberculosis, called consumption or the White Plague, was endemic. It killed more than 100,000 Americans annually. The disease spread easily in crowded urban tenements. Symptoms included a persistent cough, coughing up blood, fever, night sweats, and progressive wasting away. Sufferers might linger for years in declining health. There was no cure. The treatment recommended was fresh air, rest, and good nutrition, advice that was impossible to follow for most working-class people who lived in cramped apartments and had to work to survive. Tuberculosis sanitariums became common, isolated institutions where patients were sent in hopes that fresh air and rest might help. In reality, these were often places where people went to die slowly, separated from their families. The The social stigma of tuberculosis was powerful. People feared it intensely, and those diagnosed often faced isolation and discrimination. Diarrheal diseases, particularly those affecting children, were major killers. These diseases spread easily where sanitation was poor, which meant they were rampant in cities. Contaminated water and milk were common culprits. A child who developed severe diarrhea faced dehydration, and there was little doctors could do. Intravenous fluids weren't yet a standard treatment. Antibiotics didn't exist. Parents watched helplessly as their children weakened and died from conditions that today are easily treatable. Diphtheria was another terror. This bacterial infection created a thick coating in the throat that could suffocate children. It spread easily, and outbreaks were common. The development of antitoxin in the 1890s offered some hope, but it wasn't widely available or affordable for many families. A diphtheria diagnosis often meant a death sentence for children. Medical knowledge was advancing, but slowly. Germ theory had been established, but its practical implications were still being worked out. Many doctors still didn't understand the importance of hand washing or sterilizing instruments. Hospitals were dangerous places. You were as likely to contract a deadly infection in a hospital as to be cured of what brought you there. Surgery was primitive by modern standards. Anesthesia existed, using ether or chloroform, but it was crude and dangerous. Surgeons operated in regular clothes, maybe wearing a rubber apron. The idea of a sterile operating room was just beginning to take hold. Antibiotics didn't exist, so any surgery that opened the body risked massive infection. Post-operative infections killed many patients who survived the surgery itself. Pain relief was limited. Aspirin had just been introduced by Bayer in 1899 and was becoming popular, but it was the only effective over-the-counter pain reliever available. For more severe pain, doctors might prescribe opiates like morphine or laudanum, an opium-based tincture that was wildly addictive. Many people, particularly women, became addicted to patent medicines that contained opiates, cocaine, or alcohol, often without knowing what they were consuming. Speaking of patent medicines, the early 1900s was their golden age. These were the cure-alls advertised in newspapers and sold by traveling medicine shows. They promised to cure everything from cancer to nervousness to female complaints. Most were useless. Many were dangerous. They typically contained alcohol, opiates, cocaine, mercury, or other substances that might produce a temporary sense of well-being, but did nothing to cure disease and often caused addiction or poisoning. Women's reproductive health was particularly neglected and misunderstood. Childbirth was dangerous. Maternal mortality was high, with thousands of women dying in childbirth or from complications every year. Most births happened at home, attended by midwives or occasionally by doctors. Cesarean sections were rare and extremely dangerous. If labor went wrong, there were few options. Forceps deliveries could save babies, but often caused terrible damage to mothers. Contraception was illegal under the Comstock laws, passed in 1873. These federal laws made it illegal to send information about birth control through the mail and gave states the power to ban contraceptives entirely. Margaret Sanger wouldn't open the first birth control clinic in America until 1916, and even then, she was arrested for it. Women had few reliable ways to control their fertility, leading to large families whether wanted or not, and to dangerous illegal abortions when desperate. Dental care was primitive. Many people lost most or all of their teeth by middle age. Toothbrushes existed but weren't common. Tooth powder or baking soda might be used occasionally, but regular teeth cleaning as we know it was rare. Toothaches were common and excruciating. The treatment was extraction, performed by a dentist or sometimes by a barber. often with no anesthesia or just a shot of whiskey for courage. Dentures were common among middle-aged and older adults. Mental health treatment was barbaric. People with mental illness were often locked away in asylums where conditions were deplorable. Treatment consisted of restraints, cold baths, isolation, and worse. There was little understanding of mental illness as medical conditions. People with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or bipolar disorder were often simply labeled as insane and removed from society. Shell shock, what we'd now call PTSD, wouldn't even be recognized until World War I, and even then, sufferers were often accused of cowardice. Chronic diseases like diabetes were death sentences. Insulin wouldn't be discovered until 1921. Before that, a diabetes diagnosis meant slow starvation as doctors tried to control blood sugar through increasingly restrictive diets. Most diabetes patients died within a few years of diagnosis. Cancer was largely untreatable. Surgery might be attempted for some tumors, but once cancer spread, there was nothing to be done. Radiation therapy was in its absolute infancy, and chemotherapy wouldn't be developed for decades. Most cancer patients simply endured progressive deterioration and pain until death. The practice of medicine itself was undergoing transformation. Medical education was being reformed. The American Medical Association had been founded in 1847, but was really gaining power around 1900. Medical schools were beginning to require actual scientific training rather than just apprenticeship. But many practicing doctors in 1900 had minimal formal education. Some had attended proper medical schools. Others had simply apprenticed with older physicians or attended diploma mills that provided a medical degree for a fee. Public health was beginning to emerge as a field. Some cities were establishing health departments and hiring health officers. They were beginning to understand that clean water and proper sewage systems could prevent disease. The great sanitation projects of the late 1800s and early 1900s, building sewer systems and providing clean water, probably did more to improve health and extend life expectancy than all the medical treatments available. The America of the early 1900s was a nation in the midst of a transportation revolution. Multiple technologies competed, and the outcome wasn't yet certain. Would the future belong to electric vehicles or gasoline cars, to trains or automobiles, to horses or motors? In 1900, all these options coexisted, and Americans were experimenting with them all. Horses still dominated transportation, especially for short distances. In 1900, Manhattan alone had an estimated 130,000 horses. Chicago had 74,000. These horses pulled everything: carriages for passengers, wagons for freight, streetcars on rails, fire engines, ambulances, milk wagons, bread wagons, and more. Horses were everywhere, which created enormous problems. They needed to be fed, watered, and stabled. They produced vast quantities of manure, an estimated 800,000 to 1,300,000 pounds per day in New York City alone. Dead horses, which fell at an alarming rate from overwork and disease, had to be removed from the streets. In New York, sanitation workers removed about 15,000 dead horses annually. The horse manure problem was serious. It piled up on streets. Rain turned it into a disgusting slurry that splattered pedestrians and got tracked into buildings. It dried and became dust that filled the air, contributing to respiratory diseases. It bred flies that spread disease. Reformers genuinely worried about cities drowning in horse manure as urban populations grew. Then came the bicycle. The 1990s saw a bicycle craze sweep America. The development of the safety bicycle, with 2 equal-sized wheels and a chain drive, made cycling accessible to almost everyone. By 1900, bicycles were common, particularly among younger people and women. Bicycles offered personal mobility without the cost and care of a horse. Women especially embraced bicycling, and the bicycle became associated with women's liberation. Riding a bicycle required less restrictive clothing than Victorian norms dictated, and the mobility it provided was empowering. Electric streetcars, also called trolleys, transformed urban transportation in the 1890s and early 1900s. These replaced horse-drawn streetcars and moved faster, carried more passengers, and didn't produce manure. Electric trolleys ran on tracks, powered by overhead wires. They were efficient and popular, and their routes determined where cities grew. Suburbs developed along trolley lines, allowing workers to live farther from their jobs. The term streetcar suburb entered the language. By 1900, electric trolleys operated in most American cities. Trains remained the dominant form of long-distance transportation. By 1900, America had the most extensive railroad network in the world, with over 350,000 miles of track connecting cities and towns. Transcontinental railroads made it possible to travel from New York to California in a week, a journey that had taken months by wagon just a few decades earlier. Train travel was available to all classes, but the experience varied dramatically. First-class passengers enjoyed comfortable seats, dining cars with tablecloths and multiple courses, and sleeping compartments with real beds. Third-class passengers sat on hard benches in crowded cars without amenities. Immigrant trains carried millions of new arrivals from East Coast ports to destinations in the interior, packed into freight cars with minimal accommodation. And then there was the automobile. In 1900, cars were a novelty. About 8,000 automobiles existed in the entire United States. Most were custom-built or produced in tiny numbers by small manufacturers. Three types of cars competed: steam-powered, electric, and gasoline-powered internal combustion. Electric cars were actually the early leaders. In 1900, manufacturers produced about 1,575 electric vehicles, compared to only 936 gasoline cars. Electric cars were quiet, clean, easy to operate, and required no hand cranking to start. Wealthy women particularly favored them for city driving. They had a limited range, typically 30 to 50 miles, and took a long time to recharge, but for city use, these limitations weren't prohibitive. Gasoline cars were noisy, smelly, temperamental, and difficult to operate. Starting them required cranking a handle at the front of the car, a task that could break your arm if the engine kicked back. They broke down frequently, but they had advantages: greater range and quicker refueling. As gasoline became cheaper and more widely available, and as roads improved, gasoline cars gained ground. The automobile was still an expensive toy for the wealthy in the early 1900s. Cars cost anywhere from $500 to several $1,000s, equivalent to tens of thousands in today's money. A basic Model T, introduced by Henry Ford in 1908 at a price of $850, still cost more than a year's wages for most workers. Only the well-off could afford automobiles. But Ford's innovation of the assembly line in 1913 changed everything. By breaking automobile manufacturing into simple, repetitive tasks performed by workers along a moving assembly line, Ford could produce cars much faster and cheaper. The price of a Model T dropped to less than $300 by the mid-1920s. Suddenly, cars became attainable for middle-class families. By 1930, more than half of American families owned an automobile. The automobile's rise wasn't inevitable, though. Early cars faced enormous challenges. Roads outside cities were terrible. Most were unpaved, rutted dirt tracks that became impassable mud pits in rain. Long-distance automobile travel was an adventure requiring determination and luck. When Horatio Nelson Jackson and Sewell Crocker made the first automobile crossing of the United States in 1903, it took 63 days, and they faced constant mechanical breakdowns and road problems. Cities weren't designed for automobiles. Streets were narrow, designed for horses and wagons. There were no parking lots, no gas stations, no traffic lights, no road signs. Early automobile drivers competed with horses, trolleys, bicycles, and pedestrians for space on crowded streets. Accidents were common. Pedestrians, used to streets as shared public space, didn't immediately adapt to fast-moving cars. The oil industry grew rapidly to support the automobile. In 1900, petroleum was used mainly for kerosene for lamps and as a lubricant. The discovery of oil in Texas and other states created an abundant supply. Gasoline, once a waste product from refining kerosene, suddenly became valuable. Gas stations began appearing along major routes. Air travel was pure fantasy in 1900. The Wright brothers wouldn't achieve powered flight until 1903, and even then, it was a tentative 12-second hop. Aviation remained experimental through the 1900s and 1910s. World War I would spur rapid development of military aircraft, but commercial air travel wouldn't become practical until the 1920s and wouldn't become common until decades later. Inside homes, technology was also transforming life, at least for those who could afford it. Electric lighting was perhaps the most visible change. Thomas Edison had developed practical incandescent bulbs in the 1880s, and cities built power plants and distribution networks through the 1890s and early 1900s. By 1910, many urban homes had electric lighting, a revolutionary improvement over gas lamps or kerosene. The telephone was another transformative technology. Alexander Graham Bell had patented the telephone in 1876, and by 1900, telephone service was available in many cities. But telephones were expensive. Most working-class families couldn't afford telephone service. Businesses and wealthier households installed phones, but for many Americans, using a telephone meant going to a neighbor's house or using a payphone. Early telephones required operators to connect calls. You picked up the phone, an operator came on the line, and you told her which number you wanted. The operator then physically connected your line to the recipient's line. This system employed thousands of young women as telephone operators, creating a new form of women's work. Automated switching would come later. The telegraph, developed decades earlier, remained important for long-distance communication. Western Union had telegraph lines across the country. Telegrams were how people sent urgent messages. News traveled by telegraph. Financial information moved by wire. The telegraph integrated America economically and informationally in ways that seem prosaic now but were revolutionary then. But most Americans in 1900 still lived without electricity, telephones, or any of the new technologies. Rural areas wouldn't get widespread electric service for another 3 decades. For them, life continued in patterns that wouldn't have been unfamiliar to their grandparents. They read by lamplight, used outhouses, and communicated by letter or not at all. The gap between urban and rural America was enormous and growing. Early 20th century America was a deeply divided society. Divisions of class, race, ethnicity, and region created separate worlds for different groups of Americans, worlds that barely touched except in relationships of exploitation and conflict. The class divide was stark. At the top were the industrial and financial titans, men like John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, who controlled vast fortunes. The Gilded Age had created wealth inequality on a scale America had never seen. The richest 1% owned a hugely disproportionate share of the nation's wealth. These men built mansions in Newport and on Fifth Avenue, collected European art, and lived lives of luxury that resembled royalty more than the Republican ideals America claimed to embody. Just below them was the emerging professional and managerial class. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, managers in large corporations, successful shopkeepers, and other white-collar workers formed a growing middle class. They were comfortable but not wealthy. They might own their homes, employ a domestic servant, take occasional vacations, and educate their children. They aspired to refinement and respectability. Below them were skilled workers, men who had trained in a craft or trade. Machinists, carpenters, printers, railroad engineers, and other skilled workers earned decent wages by the standards of the time, perhaps $1 a day or more. They might own their homes, though likely in working-class neighborhoods. They took pride in their skills and often formed the backbone of trade unions. Their standard of living was far above unskilled laborers, but they still worked long hours and faced economic insecurity. At the bottom were the unskilled workers, the masses of men and women who did the brutal physical labor that powered industrial America. They worked in factories, mines, and on docks. They dug canals and built roads. They cleaned homes and washed clothes. They earned minimal wages, lived in the worst housing, had no job security, and could be fired and replaced at any moment. Most immigrants entered America at this level, and many remained here for life. Then there were farmers, a category that cut across class lines. Some farmers owned substantial land and were quite prosperous. Most were modest operators, families who owned or rented enough land to support themselves and maybe sell some surplus. They were independent in a way wage workers weren't, but they faced their own insecurities: crop failures, falling prices, debt, and the increasing power of railroads and grain elevator companies that controlled the market. At the absolute bottom of the social ladder were sharecroppers, particularly in the South. Most were black, former slaves or descendants of slaves, trapped in a system that was slavery in all but name. They worked land they didn't own, supposedly splitting the crop with the landowner. But through manipulation of accounts and debt, landowners kept sharecroppers perpetually indebted and unable to leave. It was a system enforced by violence and legal discrimination. Race was perhaps the deepest division in American society. The promises of Reconstruction had been betrayed. After federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, white Southerners established a system of legal segregation and disenfranchisement that would last until the Civil Rights Movement. Jim Crow laws required separate schools, separate railroad cars, separate waiting rooms, separate drinking fountains. Separate but equal was the lie that justified this system. Facilities for Black Americans were never equal, always inferior. Black Americans were systematically denied the right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence. Lynching was common. Between 1890 and 1900, more than 1,000 African Americans were lynched in the United States, murdered by white mobs with the complicity or active participation of local authorities. Lynchings were public spectacles, sometimes advertised in advance, attended by thousands, and photographed for postcards. The bodies were left hanging as warnings. In the North, Black Americans faced different but still significant discrimination. They weren't subject to Jim Crow laws, but they faced housing discrimination, job discrimination, and social exclusion. Most could vote, but faced significant barriers. Black workers were largely excluded from most unions. They were confined to the worst jobs and the worst housing. Many northern cities had small black populations in 1900, but would see massive migration from the South during the Great Migration, beginning around World War I. Immigrants faced their own forms of discrimination. The massive wave of immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe brought people who looked different, spoke different languages, practiced different religions, and had different customs. Native-born Americans, particularly those from Northern and Western European backgrounds, viewed these new immigrants with suspicion and hostility. Scientific racism was respectable in the early 1900s. Educated people believed in racial hierarchies, with Anglo-Saxons at the top and others arranged below. These ideas were taught in schools and universities. Immigration restriction leagues lobbied to limit or stop immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. Their arguments rested on claims that these immigrants were racially inferior, unassimilable, and a threat to American civilization. Immigrants faced discrimination in employment. Many jobs were advertised with "No Irish Need Apply" or similar restrictions. They were paid less than native-born workers for the same work. They lived in ethnic enclaves partly by choice, wanting to be near people who spoke their language and shared their customs, but also because discrimination limited their housing options. Different immigrant groups faced different levels of discrimination. Irish and German immigrants, who had been arriving for decades, were becoming more accepted, though discrimination persisted. Italian immigrants faced particular hostility, stereotyped as criminals and anarchists. Eastern European Jews faced both ethnic and religious discrimination. Chinese immigrants on the West Coast faced the most extreme discrimination, leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which remained in effect. Religious divisions cut across ethnic lines. America was overwhelmingly Protestant, and Catholic and Jewish immigrants faced discrimination for their religions. Catholics were suspected of being more loyal to the Pope than to America. Anti-Semitism was open and socially acceptable. Jews were excluded from many social clubs, residential neighborhoods, universities, and professions. Regional divisions also mattered. The South remained economically backward, still not recovered from the Civil War. Its economy was agricultural, based primarily on cotton and sharecropping. It was poor, rural, and deeply conservative. The North was industrial, urban, and progressive. The West was developing, its identity still being formed. These regional differences created distinct cultures and political alignments that would shape American politics for decades. To be a woman in early 20th century America was to live under a complex system of legal, social, and economic restrictions that seem almost incomprehensible today. Yet it was also a time of growing challenge to these restrictions, as women organized, protested, and demanded rights they'd been denied. A woman's legal status depended largely on her marital status. Under the doctrine of coverture, inherited from English common law, a married woman's legal identity merged with her husband's. She couldn't own property in her own name in most states. Any wages she earned belonged to her husband. She couldn't sign contracts without his permission. If she left her husband, he had automatic custody of their children. Married Women's Property Acts, passed by many states beginning in the 1830s, had begun to chip away at these restrictions, but full legal equality remained distant. Single women had more legal rights than married women, but faced different restrictions. They could own property and control their own wages. But social expectations were clear. A woman's proper role was as wife and mother. A single woman, especially one past a certain age, was pitiable, a failure. The term spinster carried contempt. Most middle-class women in 1900 didn't work outside the home after marriage. Their role was domestic, managing the household, raising children, and creating a comfortable home for their husbands. This was actually a sign of status. A woman who worked was advertising that her husband couldn't support the family, which carried shame. But this ideal of domestic femininity was attainable only for middle-class and wealthy women. Working-class women, immigrant women, and black women had always worked. They had to work for their families to survive. They worked in factories, as domestic servants, doing laundry, or any other work they could find. The ideology of separate spheres, men in the public world of work and politics, women in the private world of home and family, never applied to poor women. They inhabited both worlds, working for wages while also managing households and raising children. Education for women had expanded significantly in the late 1800s, but it remained limited in 1900. Women could attend college, but relatively few did. Women's colleges like Vassar, Smith, and Wellesley provided education for the daughters of the wealthy. Some state universities had begun admitting women, but most women's education ended with high school at most, and many girls didn't attend high school at all, especially in rural areas and among the poor. For those women who did work outside the home, options were limited. Teaching was considered appropriate for single women, though teachers were usually required to resign upon marriage. Clerical work was opening up as businesses needed typists, stenographers, and telephone operators. These white-collar jobs were considered more respectable than factory work, though they often paid less. Department stores employed women as salesgirls, considered a step up from factory work. Factory work itself was segregated by sex. Women worked primarily in textile mills, garment factories, and food processing plants. The work was repetitive, exhausting, and low-paid. Women earned about half what men earned for the same work. The rationale was always the same. Women were temporary workers, working until they married, so they didn't need a living wage. This ignored the reality that many working women were supporting themselves, supporting families, or supplementing inadequate wages earned by husbands. Sexual harassment was rampant and unaddressed. Women workers faced unwanted advances from male supervisors and co-workers. Refusing could mean losing your job. There was no legal recourse. The concept of sexual harassment as a legal wrong wouldn't develop until the 1970s. The suffrage movement had been fighting for women's right to vote for over 50 years by 1900. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 had launched the organized movement. Pioneers like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had dedicated their lives to the cause. By 1900, they were elderly, and Anthony would die in 1906 without seeing the victory she'd worked for. But the movement was gaining momentum. Several Western states and territories had granted women the right to vote by 1900. Wyoming had done so in 1869, followed by Colorado, Utah, and Idaho. These frontier states, needing to attract settlers, were more open to women's rights than the more established East. The suffrage movement wasn't monolithic. Different groups had different strategies. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, formed in 1890 from the merger of two competing organizations, focused on winning suffrage state by state. Alice Paul and others believed in pushing for a federal constitutional amendment and used more confrontational tactics. Starting in 1913, Paul organized massive parades and demonstrations. On March 3, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, more than 5,000 suffragists marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington. The parade was attacked by hostile crowds, with police doing little to protect the marchers. The publicity helped the cause. Paul and her followers picketed the White House starting in 1917, the first group ever to do so. They were arrested repeatedly. In prison, they went on hunger strikes and were force-fed, a brutal procedure. The treatment of the suffragists in prison created a scandal that built support for their cause. Arguments for women's suffrage evolved. Early suffragists had argued from principles of natural rights. Women were people, and therefore deserved the same political rights as men. By the early 1900s, many suffragists were also arguing from expediency. Women's traditional concerns with home and family made them natural supporters of progressive reforms like temperance, child labor laws, and education. Giving women the vote would help advance these reforms. Some suffragists used racist arguments, particularly in the South. They argued that giving white women the vote would help maintain white supremacy by outnumbering black voters. These arguments are ugly to modern ears, but they reflected the strategic calculations some suffragists made to build support. Black women faced a double bind. They supported suffrage, but were often excluded from white-dominated suffrage organizations. They formed their own organizations and fought for voting rights, while also fighting against lynching and for civil rights more broadly. Leaders like Ida B. Wells Barnett and Mary Church Terrell worked for both racial justice and women's rights. The suffrage movement was part of a broader progressive movement for reform. Women's clubs, organized in towns and cities across America, worked for social reforms, better schools, playgrounds, clean water, child labor laws, temperance, and suffrage. These clubs gave women experience in organizing and public advocacy, training a generation of activists. World War I provided a final push for suffrage. Women's contributions to the war effort, working in factories, serving as nurses, supporting Liberty Bond drives, made it harder to argue they were too delicate for politics. President Wilson, who had opposed suffrage, finally endorsed it in 1918. Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1919, and it was ratified in 1920. The victory was incomplete, though. Black women in the South, like black men, would continue to face disenfranchisement through Jim Crow laws for decades, and many of the dramatic changes women had hoped the vote would bring didn't materialize. Getting the vote didn't immediately transform women's social or economic status. But it was a crucial milestone, opening the door for future progress. Childhood in early 20th century America bore little resemblance to childhood today. The very concept of childhood as a protected period of life, a time for education and play rather than work, was only beginning to gain traction among reformers, though it remained out of reach for millions of children. For middle-class children, childhood looked something like what we'd recognize. They attended school, they played, they had toys, though nothing like the consumer abundance that would characterize later decades. A doll, a ball, perhaps a bicycle represented significant possessions. Children made their own entertainment, playing games in streets and yards, inventing their own fun. But for working class and poor children, especially those of immigrants and Black Americans, childhood was far different. We've already discussed child labor, but it's worth emphasizing how common it was. In 1900, 1 in 5 American workers was under 16. These children weren't playing after school. They were working 10 or 12-hour shifts in factories, mines, or fields. Child labor reformers documented conditions through photography and written reports. Lewis Hines' photographs of child workers, taken for the National Child Labor Committee beginning in 1908, showed the reality. Young children standing at machines in textile mills, coal-smudged breaker boys in anthracite mines, children working in glass factories in terrible heat. These images shocked middle-class Americans and helped build support for child labor laws. But reform was slow. Business interests opposed child labor laws, arguing that families needed the income children provided and that regulating business violated free market principles. Some families did depend on children's wages, a bitter reality of poverty. Reformers had to fight not only businesses, but sometimes desperate parents, for whom a child's small paycheck might mean the difference between rent and eviction. States began passing child labor laws, usually setting minimum ages for employment and maximum hours for child workers. But these laws were often weak and poorly enforced. Families lied about children's ages. Businesses looked the other way. It wasn't until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 that effective national restrictions on child labor took effect, and that came after our period. Education expanded significantly in the early 1900s, but it was far from universal. Compulsory education laws requiring children to attend school spread state by state, but enforcement was inconsistent. In rural areas, children were often kept home during planting and harvest when their labor was needed. In cities, poor families needed children to work. Truancy was common, and school officials had limited ability to enforce attendance. Schools themselves varied enormously in quality. In prosperous urban and suburban areas, new school buildings were constructed with proper lighting, heating, and sanitation. These schools had trained teachers, graded classrooms, and relatively small class sizes. Students learned reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and geography from standardized textbooks. But in poor urban neighborhoods, schools were overcrowded and under-resourced. Classes of 50 or more students were common. Buildings were old and inadequate. Teachers, themselves often poorly trained and paid little, struggled to maintain order and teach basic skills. High turnover among students, as families moved frequently and children came and went from the workforce, made continuity difficult. Rural schools were another world entirely. Many rural children attended one-room schoolhouses where a single teacher taught all grades together. These schools operated only during seasons when children weren't needed for farm work. Teachers were often young women with minimal training themselves, expected to teach all subjects to children of all ages. Educational materials were scarce. In the South, schools for black children were grossly inferior, underfunded, and operated only a few months per year. The curriculum in early 1900 schools was traditional. Reading, writing, and arithmetic dominated. History and geography were taught, emphasizing American patriotism and the superiority of American institutions. Discipline was strict. Corporal punishment was common and accepted. Teachers used rulers or paddles to enforce obedience. The goal was to instill basic literacy, numeracy, and social discipline. For immigrant children, schools served an additional function: Americanization. Educators and reformers believed immigrant children needed to be taught American values and culture, and schools were the primary instrument. Children were discouraged from speaking their native languages. They were taught American history that minimized or ignored their own backgrounds. The goal was to create Americans out of these children, which often meant suppressing their cultural heritage. High school was still relatively rare. Most children left school after 8th grade if they made it that far. High school was for the middle class. Only about 10% of children attended high school in 1900, and even fewer graduated. Those who did could look forward to white-collar work or college. College was for the elite. Only about 4% of young adults attended college in 1900. Universities remained small, selective institutions, primarily serving the children of the wealthy. They were also overwhelmingly white and male, though women's colleges existed and some universities had begun admitting women. Black students faced severe discrimination. Many colleges excluded them entirely. Historically, black colleges and universities, founded after the Civil War, provided education for black students who couldn't attend white institutions. For children, medical care was minimal. Many children never saw a doctor unless seriously ill. School health programs barely existed. Vision and dental problems went untreated. Malnutrition was common among poor children. Diseases that today we prevent with vaccines killed thousands of children. Parents simply expected that some children wouldn't survive to adulthood, a grim reality that shaped their emotional lives in ways we can barely imagine. Play and leisure for children who had the luxury of free time was simpler than today. Children played outside, in streets and yards and parks. They played games that required little equipment: tag, hide and seek, marbles, jump rope. Boys played baseball, increasingly popular as America's game. Girls played with dolls and played house. Both invented elaborate imaginary games. Commercialized entertainment for children was limited but growing. Cheap juvenile books and magazines, created specifically for children, appeared in the late 1800s and expanded in the early 1900s. Dime novels and story papers, often sensational and disapproved of by reformers, were popular with working-class children. Middle-class children might receive books as gifts, classics like Treasure Island or Little Women. But for millions of children, childhood was primarily work. It was getting up before dawn to work in a factory. It was suffering injuries that would mark them for life. It was going to bed hungry in a crowded tenement. It was being denied education and opportunity. Childhood, as a time of innocence and play, was a middle-class ideal that much of America couldn't afford. When they did have free time, what did early 20th century Americans do for entertainment? The answer varied by class, location, and means, but it was generally much simpler than the constant stream of content we consume today. For most people, entertainment was social and local. People visited neighbors and relatives. They sat on porches in the evening, talking. In rural areas, community gatherings, church socials, and occasional traveling shows broke the monotony. County fairs were major events, combining agricultural exhibitions with entertainment. Reading was a primary form of entertainment for those who could read and afford books or subscriptions to newspapers and magazines. Libraries, both private circulating libraries and the public libraries being established through Andrew Carnegie's philanthropy, provided access to books for many who couldn't afford to buy them. Newspapers were cheap and widely read. In cities, multiple papers competed, each with its own political slant. People followed serialized stories, checked the racing results, and read the sensational crime news that sold papers. Magazines proliferated. General interest magazines like the Saturday Evening Post, Harper's, and McClure's reached broad audiences. They published fiction, articles on current events, and increasingly, muckraking journalism that exposed corporate and government corruption. Women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal provided patterns, recipes, advice, and fiction aimed at female readers. Vaudeville was the dominant form of commercial entertainment in cities. Vaudeville shows presented a variety of acts: comedians, singers, dancers, acrobats, magicians, and novelty acts. Shows played multiple times daily in theaters that ranged from elegant to seedy. Vaudeville was affordable entertainment for the working class while also attracting middle-class audiences. It was here that many performers who would later become famous in movies and radio cut their teeth. Theater, both serious drama and musical comedy, thrived in cities. New York's Broadway was establishing itself as the center of American theater. Touring companies brought productions to smaller cities, but theater tickets were expensive enough that they were primarily middle-class entertainment. Working people might save up for an occasional show, but theater wasn't part of their regular entertainment. Music was central to entertainment. In the home, families gathered around the piano, assuming they had one, to sing popular songs. Sheet music was a major industry. People bought sheet music for new songs and played them at home. This was the era of Tin Pan Alley, when songwriters churned out popular songs that swept the nation. On the street, in parks, and in social clubs, people listened to live music. Every ethnic group brought its own musical traditions. Italian bands played in Italian neighborhoods. German beer gardens featured German music. In the South, black musicians were developing what would become the blues and eventually rock and roll, though these developments were only beginning. Ragtime was sweeping the nation by 1900. This syncopated piano music, pioneered by black musicians like Scott Joplin, was exciting and new. It scandalized some, who considered it immoral, but it was wildly popular, especially among young people. Ragtime would evolve into jazz in the 1910s and 20s. Saloons were central to working-class male leisure, particularly among immigrants. Saloons were more than just places to drink. They were social centers, sometimes employment offices, places to cash checks, read newspapers, and meet friends. The temperance movement's battle against saloons was partly about alcohol, but also about controlling working-class leisure and culture. Sports were becoming increasingly popular spectator entertainment. Baseball was firmly established as the national pastime. Professional leagues drew large crowds. The World Series, first played in 1903, captured national attention. But baseball was also played everywhere, by adults and children, in cities and rural areas, by amateur teams and semi-pro leagues. It was truly America's game. Boxing was popular, though controversial. Bare-knuckle boxing had given way to gloved boxing under Queensberry rules, but it remained brutal. Major fights drew enormous crowds and generated huge betting. Heavyweight champions like John L. Sullivan and later Jack Johnson became national figures. College football was developing into a major sport, though it was far more violent than today's game, with frequent serious injuries and deaths. Professional football wouldn't develop until later. Horse racing attracted crowds and, more importantly, attracted heavy betting. Racetracks operated in many cities, and results were followed eagerly in newspapers. Then, in the early 1900s, came moving pictures. The first movie theaters, called Nickelodeons because admission cost a nickel, opened in storefronts around 1905. These small theaters showed short films, usually lasting only a few minutes. The films were silent, accompanied by live music from a piano or organ player. They were crude by today's standards, but they were magical to audiences. Movies grew rapidly in popularity. By 1910, an estimated 26 million Americans attended movies each week. Movie theaters were affordable entertainment for the working class and immigrants. You didn't need to understand English to follow the visual stories. Movies provided escape, excitement, drama, and comedy for a nickel. The content of early movies was simple. Short comedies with slapstick humor, often featuring pratfalls and chases. Simple dramas, sometimes based on literature. Actualities, early documentary films showing real events or exotic locations. The Great Train Robbery from 1903, an 11-minute Western, was an early blockbuster, demonstrating that movies could tell stories. As films became more sophisticated, movie palaces replaced Nickelodeons. These were purpose-built theaters, increasingly lavish, where movies were presented with more ceremony. By the 19-teens, feature-length films were being produced, and movie stars were being born. But that development would accelerate after our period. For those with means, leisure could include travel, though it looked different than today. Wealthy Americans took extended trips to Europe, which meant weeks aboard an ocean liner each way. They visited resorts, taking advantage of the railroad network to reach fashionable destinations like Saratoga Springs in New York or Hot Springs in Arkansas. They took tours of the American West, viewing natural wonders like Yellowstone and the Grand Canyon. But for most Americans, leisure was constrained by time and money. Working 6 days a week left only Sunday for rest. Vacations, as we know them, didn't exist for most workers. Entertainment had to be cheap and local. It was found in simple pleasures: a walk in the park, a community picnic, a church social, a vaudeville show on a rare night out, sitting on the porch as evening cooled after a hot summer day. The divide between urban and rural America was perhaps the defining geographic split of the early 1900s. The two Americas lived almost in different centuries, certainly in radically different circumstances. Urban America was growing explosively. Between 1860 and 1910, the urban population increased from 6 million to 44 million. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia had populations in the millions. They were centers of industry, commerce, culture, and innovation. They were also centers of crowding, poverty, corruption, and social problems. Cities offered opportunities that drew people from rural areas and from overseas. Factory jobs, however poorly paid, represented wages. Cities had entertainment, culture, diversity, and excitement. They had public transportation, allowing workers to live some distance from their jobs. They had department stores, restaurants, libraries, theaters, and all the amenities of modern life. But cities were also deeply troubled. Housing was inadequate for the flood of new residents. Tenements were nightmares we've already described. Sanitation was a massive challenge. Cities generated enormous quantities of garbage and sewage. Some cities were building modern sewer systems and establishing sanitation departments, but many still relied on cesspools and open ditches. Water supply was another challenge. Clean water was essential to prevent waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid. Cities built waterworks, reservoirs, and aqueducts, some of them engineering marvels. But contamination remained a problem. Many deadly disease outbreaks in cities traced to contaminated water supplies. Air pollution was severe in industrial cities. Coal smoke from factories, power plants, and home heating filled the air with soot and sulfur dioxide. In cities like Pittsburgh, the smoke was so thick that streetlights had to be kept on during the day. Laundry hung to dry turned black. Respiratory diseases were common. The term smog was coined in London to describe the combination of smoke and fog, but American industrial cities had their own versions. Crime and vice flourished in cities. Police forces, though growing, were often corrupt and ineffective. Politicians controlled police appointments, and police did the bidding of political machines. Vice districts, where prostitution, gambling, and drug use were tolerated in exchange for payoffs, existed in most cities. Reformers crusaded against vice, with mixed success. Political corruption was endemic. Political machines, like New York's Tammany Hall, controlled city governments. They provided services to immigrants and the poor, helping them navigate bureaucracy, finding them jobs, helping in times of need. In exchange, they demanded loyalty and votes. Machine politicians grew rich through graft, kickbacks, and outright theft of public funds. Reform movements periodically arose, but often failed to dislodge the machines. Yet cities were also centers of reform. Settlement houses, pioneered by Jane Addams' Hull House in Chicago, provided services to immigrant communities. English classes, child care, health care, cultural programs. Settlement workers studied social conditions and advocated for reform. They were part of the broader progressive movement pushing for change. Cities had cultural advantages. Museums, concert halls, libraries, and universities were concentrated in cities. For those who could afford them, cities offered rich cultural lives. Immigrant communities maintained their own cultural institutions, theaters, newspapers, social clubs, religious institutions. This created vibrant ethnic neighborhoods that kept traditions alive. Urban life meant crowds. You were never alone in a city. Streets were packed. Streetcars were jammed. Parks were busy. This density created a particular urban culture, fast-paced, aggressive, anonymous. People didn't know their neighbors in the way rural people did. Relationships were transactional. This anonymity could be liberating, allowing people to reinvent themselves, but it could also be isolating. Rural America was the opposite in almost every way. Rural life meant isolation, small communities where everyone knew everyone, a slower pace tied to natural rhythms. Most Americans in 1900 still lived in rural areas, though cities were rapidly catching up. Rural life meant farming for most. We've discussed agricultural labor, but it's worth emphasizing how all-consuming it was. Farming without modern machinery was brutally hard work. Plowing, planting, cultivating, and harvesting all required heavy manual labor. Livestock required daily care. There was always work to be done. But rural life also had rhythms different from urban industrial work. Farm work varied by season. Winter was slower, a time for maintenance and planning. Spring and fall were intense. Summer was hot, hard work, but also brought the reward of fresh produce. Farmers weren't watching the clock. They worked until the work was done, which could mean very long days, but also meant flexibility unknown to factory workers. Rural communities were small and tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone, for better and worse. Gossip traveled fast. Social pressure to conform was intense. But these communities also supported their members in ways cities couldn't. When someone got sick or injured, neighbors helped with the work. When disaster struck, communities rallied. Social life revolved around church, school, and community gatherings. Rural areas lacked the amenities of cities. No electricity in most places until the 1930s. No running water or indoor plumbing. No movie theaters or vaudeville shows. Entertainment was simpler and more participatory. Dances, church socials, visiting neighbors, hunting and fishing, reading when time and energy allowed. Education in rural areas was limited, as we've discussed. Children often left school after completing 8th grade, if they made it that far, to work on the farm. Higher education was rare and required leaving the community. Medical care was even more limited than in cities. Doctors were scarce in rural areas. People relied on folk remedies and hoped for the best. Childbirth was particularly dangerous, with women giving birth at home with only a midwife or female relatives present. When serious illness struck, options were few. Yet rural people often looked down on cities as dens of sin and corruption. Rural life, they felt, was morally superior. The countryside represented traditional American values: hard work, independence, faith, community. Cities represented everything wrong with modern life: crowding, vice, foreigners, radicalism. This tension between urban and rural America would shape politics for decades. Rural areas were overrepresented in state legislatures and Congress due to how districts were drawn, giving rural interests disproportionate power even as cities grew. Prohibition, the movement to ban alcohol that would succeed with the 18th Amendment in 1919, was largely a rural and small-town crusade against urban immigrant culture. The cultural battles of the 1920s over evolution, over modern versus traditional values, were largely urban-rural conflicts. So what was life really like in America during the early 1900s? Complicated, contradictory, transforming. It was a time of remarkable progress and persistent injustice, of new opportunities and ancient prejudices, of gleaming innovation and grinding poverty existing side by side. For many Americans, daily life was hard in ways we can barely imagine. Work was exhausting and dangerous. Housing was inadequate. Food was monotonous and often unsafe. Medical care was primitive. Death from disease or accident was always near. The gap between rich and poor was enormous, and social mobility, while possible, was limited for most. Yet people endured. They built lives, raised families, found joy in small pleasures. They created communities, maintained traditions, and work toward better futures for their children. The immigrants who arrived in such numbers were courageous people, leaving everything familiar to take a chance on an uncertain future. The workers who organized unions and fought for better conditions showed remarkable courage in the face of powerful opposition. The women who demanded suffrage and challenged restrictions on their lives changed the nation. The early 1900s was a pivot point. The rural, agricultural America of the 19th century was giving way to the urban, industrial America of the 20th. Old certainties were dissolving. New technologies were changing how people lived, worked, and thought. The progressive movement was challenging laissez-faire capitalism and advocating for government intervention to address social problems. These debates over the proper role of government, over who counts as American, over what kind of society we want to be, resonate to this day. Looking back from our vantage point, it's easy to focus on what the early 1900s lacked: no computers or smartphones, no social media or streaming video, no air conditioning or modern medicine. Life expectancy was 30 years shorter. Child mortality was devastatingly high. Discrimination was open and legal. Working conditions were brutal. But we should also recognize what they had. Communities were tighter, relationships deeper. People made their own entertainment, creating culture rather than just consuming it. They had resilience born of facing real hardship. They had hope, believing that progress was possible and working to achieve it. The reforms they fought for, the rights they won, the systems they built, are foundations we rely on today. Child labor laws, workplace safety regulations, pure food and drug laws, women's suffrage, public education, public health measures, all of these came from the struggles of people in this era who saw injustice and fought to change it. The early 1900s reminds us that progress isn't inevitable. It comes from people organizing, demanding change, refusing to accept the status quo. The 8-hour day, the weekend, the end of child labor, safe working conditions, women's right to vote, none of these things happened automatically. People fought for them, sometimes for decades. It also reminds us that our own time will someday be history, examined by future generations who will find some of our practices shocking just as we find theirs. We live in a time of our own challenges and opportunities. What will people a century from now think of how we lived? The early 1900s was a time when Americans confronted fundamental questions about what kind of nation they wanted to be. Those questions aren't resolved. We're still working on them, still striving toward that more perfect union that always seems just out of reach, but that each generation moves toward in its own way. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in a world of modern conveniences that people in 1900 could barely imagine, spare a thought for those Americans who lived in harder times, but whose work and sacrifice built the foundation for the world we inhabit. Their struggles shaped our present. Their dreams live on in ours. And if you enjoyed this journey back in time, remember to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history. Drop a comment telling me what period or topic you'd like to explore next. Thanks for watching, and sleep well, knowing that for all our challenges, we've come a long way from where we were a century ago, and we have those who came before to thank for it. Until next time, good night.